And soon enough, I got to know the family. I got to know his wonderful wife, Prem Kumari, who we all call Tiny, and the three children, Meenakshi, Abhijit, and Madhvi. NK's book is in three parts. The first is personal, and it's actually charming because it deals with the early part of his life, the role that his father, Mr. T.P. Singh, who was a member of the IAS and indeed a revenue secretary and an expenditure secretary before MK, many years before MK, and his mother, Madhuri Singh. The second is about the progression of his career from being a district magistrate in Bihar to where he is now the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. And the third, which is perhaps the most important part of the book, is the major issues that he throws up for us to think about as we go forward. And let's move on to a discussion that I have the privilege to moderate. We have three wonderful members. The first is our Honorable Finance Minister, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, a BJP Rajya Sabha MP, and she has been the Union Finance Minister since May 2019. Before that, she has been the Minister of Defense, as well as the Minister of Commerce and Industry. Thank you very much for being a part of the panel now. We have Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam from Singapore, who is a senior minister and coordinating minister of the Ministry of the Government of Singapore. He's one of those persons who concurrently served 8 years, both as Deputy Prime Minister as well as the Minister of Finance. And over and above being the Managing Director of the MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, he today, among other things, is the Chairman of the Monetary Authority. Thank you, Mr. Shanmugaratnam, for being there. And finally, my good friend, Mukesh Ambani, who is the Chairman and Managing Director of Reliance Industries. In his last 30 years, he has helped grow the company originally from a textile mill in Naroda, which by the way, was the finest mill in India in those days, to getting into petrochemicals, then into refineries, and then into oil in exploration and production, then into retail, then into telecommunications, and God knows what else. Thanks a lot, Mukesh, for being there. So let me start with my first question, if I may, to India's Finance Minister. Madam, when did you first meet NK? And have you worked with him? And what are the chapters of the book that you liked the most?
A reminder to just unmute your mic, ma'am. On the right-hand side of your screen, there is a small little icon, yes.
Would you want me to repeat the question, madam? Did you hear it?
No, she just needs to unmute the mic.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. To the pointed question as to when I met for the first time with NK Singh, it was when I was the Commerce Minister, but I don't specifically remember the first time I met him, but the several times after that I've met him, each time, sometime in the company and the presence of Varun Jaitley, and some other times when he had extended a lot of advice to me regarding the Commerce Ministry. But more importantly, I think that one visit to Japan, which he literally led all the way for attracting Japanese investment to India. What a fascinating trip it was. And I felt the affection and regard everybody in the establishment in Japan had for it, a local official or the top-notch administrator. No wonder the appreciation of the Japanese establishment was seen in the way in which he was given the Order of the Sun by the Imperial Palace, and also the Order of the Gold and Silver Star by the Prime Minister. So that answers the question about when did I meet him. I don't think I would pin it down to one. I met him on that particular day, but the sequence of interactions have been so enriching and rewarding.
May I ask you one more question, and then we'll go to others and come back to you. NK writes a brilliant passage where he says how the power of coordinated decision-making may well have shifted from earlier the hallowed office of the cabinet secretary. I mean, nothing could have been more hallowed than the cabinet secretary, to that of the Prime Minister's office, the PMO. It actually started, as NK points out very well, with L.K. Jha becoming the chief of the Prime Minister's office under Lal Bahadur Shastri. And the role of the PMO has become even more important and much more central today. As a senior minister and a member of cabinet, how do you view this development? I'd be very keen, and so would all of us, on your views.
It's very interesting that you picked this up for the first question or asking for my input on it. In fact, I had mulled over that particular section when I read it. And it was so very interesting that he has had a personal little keyhole view on that 1967 change which happened. And subsequent to that is also the question of how this entire parliamentary democracy works, the cabinet secretariat, or is it the PMO, and that entire section and the evolution of that. And also the way in which he would want to hurriedly wrap up that little narrative. He says, all this doesn't matter to the electorate. Right. As long as, the idea of delivering, the ability to deliver, and the leadership's confidence to do that. Typical NK style comes out of that particular articulation of how PMO versus the cabinet secretariat, and in our structure as to how this has been doing the flip-flop. But since after 1967, not majorly has it been questioned. And all. So I thought he did ignite the fire, but also happily quenched it by saying, it doesn't matter, it depends on the leader. So that gives a very good glimpse and flavor of how he's handled various contentious issues about which he refers.
Thank you very much, Minister. May I turn to Minister Shanmugaratnam? Same first question. How did you get to know the one and only NK Singh, and what are the areas where the two of you have worked together and collaborated?
Thank you very much, Omkar. Like the Honorable Finance Minister, I can't pin it down to a date, but I can remember many interactions in the last decade or longer. These were typically interactions, in fact, it started off in conference settings, but I found that there was so much to learn from NK that I subsequently got to the habit of meeting him one-on-one each time I visited India to get his insights, to get his reflections, and to get his advice. And if there's one thing about NK that I would highlight, he's not just a person of considerable erudition. He's also a pragmatist. He's someone who has, through the course of his career, like most of us aspire to be, he's been someone who's found a way of navigating through the changing currents in order to achieve the right objectives. So I've always found him interesting from that point of view, that he is not only a person of great learning and reflection, but also someone who was always trying to find a practical cause forward. And I've enjoyed greatly my conversations with him for that reason.
Thank you very much. And a quick supplementary question. Anyone who's worked in the government of Singapore for so long is bound to be asked this question. And this is truly an incredibly amazing feature of Singapore, which is how over the last 30 years, if not more, the incredibly brilliant quality of civil servants all the way through, all the way right up to the tops where you are, and all the way through this absolutely brilliant professionalism and the quality of the civil service, whether in foreign service or working within Singapore. Can you please give the viewers an idea of how Singapore consistently does it? What are the things that it emphasizes more than anything else? It's a lesson for us to learn.
Well, very briefly, Omkar, and this goes back, of course, to the early days when Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and his colleagues assumed power in Singapore, and we became an independent country. Becoming an independent country and having to survive against the odds had a way of forcing the mind. In some ways, Singapore had the tragedy of being very small and of being a new nation. But there are great advantages in that disadvantage because it forces the mind. It forced us to think very hard about how on earth we could find a way to survive, to be noticed in the world, and to be attractive as a place for business to thrive and for jobs to be created and for our people to have better lives. So adversity was our greatest advantage. And Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and his compatriots realized that in a country with no natural resources and no advantages to speak of, all we had was our people and the institutions we built. And institutions are, at the end of the day, human enterprises. And the civil service and our system of governance had to be at the core of what Singapore represented. Meritocracy and a zero tolerance for corruption. Corruption is a human failing everywhere in the world. And it's always a risk in every society, including our own. But zero tolerance on the part of the state, which means whoever you are, no matter what your connections are and how senior you are in the system, if you are found to have committed actions for personal gain, you pay a price for it. It doesn't matter who you are. But meritocracy, which is the fundamental ethos that was there in all our institutions and in our social culture, has also been very important in the civil service. It's a meritocratic system where you're promoted and you're rewarded on the basis of performance.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
That's a super answer. May I move to Mukesh? The same first question. When did you first get to know NK? And tell us about your interactions since then.
Well, for me, I
Mukesh,
call...
will you come a little closer to the mic?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So for me, I call NK uncle, because he was, as he said, that ours was a multi-generational relationship. My father, Dhirubhai, knew his father, and when he entered the service, right, my father knew him in the or as a son of his ICS friend, and that relationship grew. And then when I came back from Stanford, right, I was introduced to him as one of the brightest IAS officers, to saying, how does this country work? And that was my first interaction. And I still remember that I'd just come back from Stanford, and my first impression was that, yeah, IAS guys have style. Right? That was really my first take that I had seen. And then since then, what really struck me in my consequent interaction was his curiosity. At all times, right, he would always be more and more curious in terms of saying, okay, what's happening in your generation? what more can we do in terms of, and I have seen him in Commerce Ministry, Finance Ministry, PMO, even in the Home Ministry, right? Say, okay, now what can we do in terms of improving our border security or internal security? So the curiosity and his single-minded mindset in terms of belief and the ability of Indians and India to do and can do, and the positivity, right, that he got not only from all of us in industry, he would take those inputs, convert them into action, and make sure that he was a champion, to my mind, of the economic reforms, right, that have actually happened. In the book, he calls himself, right, a ringside view. I think that a more appropriate description of that would be that he was at least one of the modest ring masters of this economic transition in his 30 years. And I have been very fortunate to see that closely, to understand his thought process, and to benefit from it, even in my own personal development.
Thanks, Mukesh. A quick follow-up question. You know how much of a fan and how close I was to your dad. And one day in his office in Maker 4, he took out a little postcard. And you know this one, his famous postcard story. And he went around telling me that if every person had a phone like this 50 paisa postcard and could talk to each other, where would India be? Can you think about it? Now, as of June, you have almost 400 million subscribers in Jio. It's the fastest growing business and the telecom sector. So can you quickly take us through the journey, the trials, the tribulations, the failures, the successes, and the challenges?
So I think that, as you've spoken about my father, and my father is mentioned in the book. And I think that one of the best pictures, the pictures that I cherish of his expressions, is on his Japanese trip, which is also part of the book. So that is very, very, that's touched me a lot. And again, just to recap, my father was a son of a school teacher who came to the city of Mumbai to live the Indian dream in 1960. And he really came with 1,000 rupees, with the belief that if you invest in businesses of the future and you invest in talent, right, we can create our own Indian dream, and we can create one of the largest enterprises or companies in the world. And as we navigated through this, right, the journey of the book, the journey of my father in terms of the first few years was, and I think that the book mentions that there was a time where Reliance was show-caused by the government and penalized for producing more than its licensed capacity. Right? And then with the economic reforms, right, today we only incentivize production, and everything that we do today is linked to production and more production. So that is how much mindsets have changed. That is essentially our journey in terms of, so if you think about the book and think about what really has happened, we've also changed our journey from, in terms of the mindsets of the ruling class, the mindsets of the bureaucracy, to be more empowering, to liberalize, right, in terms of where we were. I still, as Reliance evolved, right, and it is only after the delicensing in 1990. Until then, we used to still struggle to create every 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 tons of polyester capacity, right? at all times there would be people like N.K. Singh who would have high aspirations for the country, saying, why can't we beat the Taiwanese, or why can't we beat the Koreans, right? And surely after 1990, when we were left on our own, right, even in polyester, right, from there till 2020, we are now among the top 2 polyester producers in the world. As Reliance recently, primarily because of our textile piece, even in the COVID crisis, we could really create all the PPEs in the shortest possible time and make India an exporter in COVID. So that is really the benefits of liberalization. As we proceed, right, and as you looked at telecom, our view was that at the end of the day, we've got to embrace technologies of the future. And this was my father's view. He'd always said that I don't want to be only a textile company. If you want to move from textiles, you should move to businesses of the future, and you should invest in next generation talent. And that is what we've done. And even when we thought through telecom together, the roadmap was very clear. The roadmap was that, yes, it will be at the price of a postcard. When technology evolves, Omkar, today it is free, right? And as we migrate into the future, it actually integrates and not only connects all people, but it connects billions of things together. And you have a society, which we call a digital society, which our Prime Minister unveiled a couple of weeks ago in his AI conference, where he has given a vision for India in terms of using technology for all sectors of our economy and for all sections. So as we see this journey, the faster we embrace technology, the faster we adopt the new technologies and adopt the future industries, we will be better off. And I have to say that in these times of COVID, I have to congratulate the finance minister for her leadership, and in the last 6 months for taking some of the most difficult second generation reforms. So we have talked about second generation reforms, but I think that we have now been bold to do our reforms in education, to do our reforms in healthcare, to do our reforms in employment and labor, to do our reforms in agriculture. And I'm sure that these will form the basis of the foundation for our future growth.
Mukesh, that's a very good segue for me to move on to the finance minister, who was enjoying all the compliments that you were giving her. And there are 2 quick questions to you, ma'am. The first is, between your first package, assistance package, over the first of the 5 days, and your subsequent one, roughly about 1.2% of the fiscal deficit has been enlarged as a part of, even though the amount is about 11% or 12%, on fiscal deficit side is about enlarged by 1.2%. Are we to expect some more packages? So that's my first question. And then I'll give, after you answer that, I'll give you, there'll be a follow-up question.
Well, I've not closed the option for another stimulus if it comes out to be, because every time we've announced one, it's been after a lot of consideration of inputs which have come from various different sections of society. Then we sit and work it out within the ministry, with the PMO, and then take a final call. So yes, I have not closed the option to come up with one more stimulus.
And my follow-up question to you, ma'am, is this. As of now, we have now 2 official estimates of the GDP, real GDP contraction for 2021. The first is by the RBI, which was 9.5%, and now the IMF has pegged it at 10.3%. There are others who peg it higher, between 11 and 15%. But now that we are in the second half of the year, would you think it appropriate in the mid-year review to come up with a finance ministry forecast for what the GDP contraction will be? It will give a lot of heft to you and the finance ministry.
That's a a very good thought, and I really appreciate that point. We have only now started doing some kind of an assessment because we waited for the commencement of the second half, which is just started. And we've got a lot of inputs which are very different from what we had in July, and ideally it should be so. So perhaps, yes, sometime we will have to come up with a statement. Whether I do it in public or whether I do it in the parliament is one thing. But obviously, the finance ministry will have to make an assessment of what it's going to be like.
So we can expect it sooner rather than later, right?
Well, I'm not sure as to what is sooner going to be. Sooner, yes, but let's see once I'm ready.
Thanks. To Mr. Shanmugaratnam. Tell us, I mean, you were both finance minister for 8 years, if I'm not mistaken, and you were the managing director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Take us through how the Ministry of Finance and the MAS delineate their tasks so that one doesn't step on the other.
It's a very good question, Omkar. Just to clarify, by the way, I was a managing director, in other words, the governor of the central bank, before I entered politics. When I came into politics and eventually became the finance minister, I was for a significant overlapping period the chairman of the central bank. And in our system, the chair of the central bank has always been a senior member of the cabinet. Typically a deputy prime minister or former prime minister. In fact, both the current and previous prime ministers were also at some point chairman of the central bank. And I'm now currently the chairman of the central bank with some executive responsibilities. So it's not just a board position. It's a somewhat unique institutional setup in Singapore. And it would not have worked. It would not have worked if not for the fact that the government, from the outset, had a very strong belief in the importance of financial stability and keeping inflation at low to moderate levels, never allowing it to get too high. It was a very strong feature of the early leaders. We had someone called Dr. Goh Keng Swee, one of the closest compatriots of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who was in fact responsible for a lot of the thinking in the central bank, but also in the finance ministry. And basically, they were all fiscal conservatives. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was a fiscal conservative. Dr. Goh was a fiscal conservative. They were all fiscal conservatives. So the traditional problem that you face in many countries, or the traditional risk of fiscal dominance of the central bank, wasn't there because they themselves valued what were traditional central bank objectives: financial stability, keeping inflation low, and not imposing on the central bank the need to finance perennial deficits. They were fiscal conservatives. So that helped greatly, and it removed a lot of the tensions you see in many countries. In fact, if you look around the advanced world today, I think we're now in a state of flux. And the old model of central bank independence is now increasingly giving way to a new relationship with government and with finance ministries that hasn't yet been defined in a clear and reliable fashion. If you look at what's happening in the midst of this pandemic, many of the actions of central banks are really quasi-fiscal policies, ensuring that SMEs have adequate access to liquidity and loans, and so on and so forth. And really, there's now a space for central bank action that is not so different from what finance ministries are concerned with. And in my opinion, it requires not urgent rethinking, but it requires at some point some reflection on how do we get complementarity between the objectives and the actions of central banks and finance ministries, so that you're not working at at tangents with each other, that you're working at joint purpose. That's something I've never had difficulty in Singapore in doing that. All the years I was in the finance ministry and also the chairman of the MAS deciding on monetary policy, I've never had a conflict in my mind as to having to balance different objectives.
Again, the reason your answer says it, which again shows how unique Singapore is, where it's one city state where there is no conflict between the Ministry of Finance and the central bank in terms of objectives. Finance Minister, Ms. Sitharaman, a quick question, and this will be the last round of questions for the want of time. If wishes were horses, what 3 big ticket reforms would you wish this government in general and you in particular to be known by? Straight out of the head. This wishes were horses, doesn't matter.
To realize the policy that we are working on, which is likely to come to the cabinet, which was one of the announcements that I made during the Atmanirbhar Bharat announcements, that there should definitely be a clear-cut mention of how Indian economy has to be. That shift away from socialistic baggages that we've been carrying all the while, some desirable, some, I wouldn't say not so desirable, but some which are becoming more and more a burden. So that policy which comes to identify areas in which public sector presence, because of reasons, very strategic or core competence and other things, is important. And the rest of the field, together with those fields, also be open for the private sector. That is something which will make a big directional shift, and I desire that to happen. It's not a wish from out of the blue. Work is going on that, and I would like to see the realization of that particular first step.
You have 2 more wishes.
Second, I would think that federalism in India has got to be really a lot more robust. It is sometimes very conveniently positioned by theoreticians to say that that's what is going to strengthen Indian democracy. But I would think a continuous real-time robustness is what is going to be possible to make this country stronger. Because otherwise, you see, even the Honorable Prime Minister periodically mentions that every state has to develop. Even if one state is left behind, it will become a baggage. Otherwise, you will have the speed with which we want to grow being slowed down because of the pull factor of those who are left behind. So we need to have greater robustness in our federal debate, federal engagements, so that India can become roaring on all the 4 engines from the point of view of economy. The 5th, which I add, is a robust federalist structure. That's the second thinking. The third thinking is if there is a magic which can help us to have our education system really catch up with all the needs of our youth, give training, give competences, and also make them ready for any job. Skill and learning cannot be kept aside or kept differently. I want education to have a magical input coming from somewhere so that we become one of those best places for students to come and study and for Indian students to have all the opportunity ready for the world.
Thank you. Lovely vision. Mukesh, last question to you, my friend. Forget about your wealth and the fact that you're the richest person in Asia and 5th richest in the world and so on and so forth. Just share in simple terms, what do you wish to be remembered by?
Well, more than what I wish to be remembered, it's not about me. It's what I can do to contribute to our society. And I think that what I'm working towards is really 3 things, as we said. Like the first is really transformation of India into a digital society. And that digital society incorporates all the future industries so that the next 30 years of India is 100 times like what we had never imagined is what we can achieve. Right? So that's the first piece that, at least in my humble way, we are working to. The second, coincidentally, combines with the magic that our respected finance minister talked about. And I think that linkages in education, and it's time to transform our education sector at any point in time. We have 200 million children in India in the education system, and it will take us 8 to 10 years to completely transform the skill base of India. And I think that what as finance minister very aptly described, what is magic, I think that we have the formula to convert that magic into reality and establish linkages between academic institutions, real world, skill training, and employment in a way that actually sustains India for much higher quality and better jobs. And the third thing that we're working towards is really transformation of energy. And we think again that the world is right and India is in the right mindset to completely, in the next few decades, move away from fossil fuels to completely renewable energy, be Atmanirbhar, and really try and see if we can make our modest contribution in terms of development of India. And in energy, it's also the development of the world in terms of this transition. The way I think about it is that what really controls life is we are already in information, right? Both with what our IT industry has done and with what we've done in communications, we are leaders in the world in information. We have to now convert that to intelligence, right? We have to have the best human resources, and we have to have our own energy and be Atmanirbhar. If I can play my small part in actually achieving this and create institutions that will perpetuate and sustain that, then I would have done my job. I don't know whether I'll succeed or not, Omkar.
Thanks, Mukesh. Last question, very quickly to Mr. Shanmugaratnam. Just a simple question. We don't have a designation such as one of them that you have now, the senior minister. What does a senior minister do?
Well, the senior minister in Singapore, which is something that started about 15 years ago, is a position that allows for senior members of cabinet to continue to play an active role in coordination, in mentoring, in engaging in joint learning together with the rest of their colleagues without being bound by a single portfolio, typically. It is part of our succession planning in Singapore in politics. Some of us move on after many years as ministers of this or that, or as deputy prime ministers, or even as prime ministers, to eventually becoming senior ministers, so that we can continue to be part of the team rather than pass from one generation to the next without some continuity and without some continuous learning. So I say this not in a patronizing way. It's not as if I'm sort of teaching my younger colleagues what to do, but we're all part of a learning enterprise in politics and in government. And it helps to have some continuity where some of us stay very actively involved in policy making and in politics. And we think it adds to a stronger overall team.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Onkar. Onkar, I'm sorry to butt in.
That ends.
No, I must butt in because I think that we had promised a Q&A, and I think it is time now to move Onkar to Q&A.
Yes.
And we have, I think, subjected our panelists to enough questions from all of us. So let's move to that next step because time is rather limited, Onkar.
So should I have found out from the list,
Yes.
6 sets of questions. So may I start with a question for Mrs. Sitharaman? It's from the Chief Minister of Meghalaya, Mr. Conrad Sangma. And the question is, Madam, your vision for the economies of Northeast and the hill states, and what special treatment might be appropriate?
Well, I think the vision of the Prime Minister for Northeast, in that bringing more life to the place, keeping it always on the top of the agenda, is a good starting point, and many of us in the last 5 years have really focused on it. Personally, I think there's just so much of the Northeast which is remaining untapped. I would, in fact, even as I answer this question, can probably recall at least one such signature feature of all the 8 states with great affection. There isn't one Northeastern state that I have not been, even as a political worker, and more so as minister. There's just so much that Northeast can contribute, and the sooner we give them the opportunity, it's not giving, they deserve it and they need it. They should be, in fact, we are making up for the last 40, 50 years of not having extended all that to them. I would think the Northeast should just be the gateway. Come do everything that you want. And I have, in fact, personal experience of how dynamic the people of Northeast are, whether in Delhi, whether in back home in their own states, or whether they are abroad. They are just fantastic youngsters, and they should be given all the access.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. A quick question from Tarun Das for Mr. Shanmugaratnam, which is, as we battle COVID, what do you think could be 3 policy priorities for India?
Well, I speak with, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So I speak with some humility here because India's challenges exceed that of most societies. But I do think that COVID and the new world that it is being shaped as we evolve out of COVID is a huge opportunity for India. The world is changing. Global supply chains are changing. Global technologies are evolving. There's a real opportunity now for India in the context of China +1 strategies, as well as in the context of India's own inherent potential being unleashed to become a major producer for the world in both goods and services. And it'll take several changes which are already underway. I think the recent reforms are moving in the right direction. I should say your production-linked incentives are off to a very good start. There has to be momentum. There has to be a focus on implementation, because it's not policy intent at the end of the day that matters, but implementation. I think, if I were to just extract, rather than come out with my own lessons, if I extract 3 essential orientations that come through in NK's book, and that have to guide us in the future. First, put ideological predilections aside. People will have ideological orientations, but put it aside. Second, focus on outcomes, not just on intent or on means. Track outcomes, have transparency of outcomes, learn from outcomes. That's a critical orientation, be it in education, including in the primary school years, or in state level and district level policies. Track outcomes and shine a light on it so that you can compare between different schools, different districts, different states, and learn from each other. And there's a lot of interesting dynamism in that. If you look at Niti Aayog School Education Quality Index, it's a source of great optimism, because it shows that there's so much divergence in outcomes between districts and states that are at roughly the same level of per capita income and what have you, which shows that something can be done. No one is trapped by legacy, and no one is trapped by simply existing levels of income and so on. There are changes that can be made, and the key is governance. In fact, if you look at education as an example, because Finance Minister was speaking about this with some passion, and so was Mukesh. What's fascinating about the Niti Aayog studies is it shows that states and districts which have long lagged can change within a short space of time by changing governance, by going for transparency in recruitment of teachers, transparency in selection of school leaders, and transparency of outcomes. It's a tremendous motivator. So
Thank you.
incentives.
Thank you very much. My final question is to Mukesh, and that comes from Mr. R.C. Bhargav. And the question is this: why do you think Indian manufacturing has still not become globally competitive? And why is manufacturing growth slower than what we would like? What can be done? A quick answer.
Well, I think that we just have to rethink and reinvent manufacturing. I would agree with Bhargav. In some areas, like we take our own refining and petrochemicals, we are most globally competitive. But I think that the opportunity for us is to embrace the future industries, think in terms of ecosystems. And the three specific things that we can do for leadership really is strengthen our small and medium sector. Right? Just like we have startups in the technology sector, I think India is ripe now to support our small and medium sector entrepreneurs and get them the physical startups. So we need as much thinking about bricks as we have about clicks. And we need to think in terms of an entire ecosystem that delivers future industries and future services. And I think that we are already on that way with what we have done with batteries and solar and all the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. So if we do that, right, rather than worrying about the past, we can think about the future, and the future is not going to be an extension of the past. We can create a new destiny in terms of ecosystems, platforms, and manufacturing, which then becomes a high generation employment piece. And we then have a play, not only for our domestic market, but all the marginal pieces we can support to the international markets.
Thank you very much, Mukesh. That comes to the end of the Q&A session. Unfortunately, there were many more questions, but it's difficult to take now. We've just a few minutes towards the end, so I shall pass it on to Rini to go on with the rest of the program. Thank you very much.